Gather close, for history remembers what the world has forgotten. The St. Cuthbert Raids, Lindisfarne 793, a narrative of the shock that started the Viking Age. June 8th, 793 AD, the feast day of St. Medard. On a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria, the morning prayers of Matins had just concluded when shapes appeared on the horizon. Dark silhouettes cutting through the North Sea mist like the fingers of some terrible hand reaching toward the most sacred place in all of Anglo-Saxon England. This was Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, where St. Aidan had first brought Christianity to the pagan kingdoms of northern England nearly 150 years before, where the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels had been crafted with painstaking devotion, where the bones of St. Cuthbert himself had rested until just over a century prior.
Wait, bones of St. Cuthbert? I thought this was about raids on St. Cuthbert.
Precisely the confusion that made this attack so devastating. You see, though Cuthbert's remains had been moved, Lindisfarne was still considered his island, his spiritual domain. The monks who lived there were his inheritors, his guardians. To attack Lindisfarne was to attack Cuthbert himself, and by extension to attack God. But to understand the true horror of what was about to unfold, we must first understand the world as it existed in that spring of 793. England was not yet England. It was a patchwork of warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each jealously guarding their territory, their treasures, and their faith. Northumbria, where Lindisfarne lay, had once been the greatest of these kingdoms. In the previous century, under kings like Oswald and Oswiu, it had dominated Britain from the Scottish borders down to the Humber River. But by 793, those glory days were fading.
So they were already weakening when this happened?
Exactly. The kingdom was fragmenting, torn by civil wars and succession disputes. King Ethelred had been murdered just 2 years before in 791. His successor, Osred II, was barely clinging to power. The Great Fyrd, the kingdom's military levy, was scattered, dealing with internal threats rather than watching the coasts. But if Northumbria's political power was waning, its spiritual authority had never been stronger. Lindisfarne represented something that transcended earthly kingdoms. It was a beacon of learning, of sanctity, of divine protection that had stood unshaken for generations. The monastery's wealth was legendary throughout Europe. Gifts from kings, nobles, and pilgrims had accumulated over decades. Golden chalices, silver crosses, illuminated manuscripts worth fortunes, reliquaries containing the bones of saints. And protecting it all? Nothing but God's will and the North Sea itself. Yet across those dark waters, in the fjords of Norway and Denmark, a different world was stirring. A world where strength mattered more than sanctity, where the gods demanded blood and battle, where young men with nothing to lose looked south toward rumored riches.
Hold on. So these weren't just random raiders?
Oh no, far from random. These were the products of a perfect storm of circumstances. Scandinavia in the late 8th century was experiencing what we might call a demographic crisis. Improved agriculture meant more children surviving to adulthood, but the harsh northern climate limited how much land could support them. Younger sons of chieftains found themselves landless, hungry for glory and wealth. The old tradition of raiding had always existed, but now it was becoming a necessity. And their ships were marvels of engineering that made such ventures possible. The longship could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. It could be beached directly on any shore, loaded with men and plunder, and pushed back out to sea in minutes. No harbor, no dock required. It was the perfect weapon for hit-and-run warfare. In the months leading up to that fateful June morning, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later record, there had been signs. Terrible omens that should have warned of the coming catastrophe. Immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning had torn across the skies of Northumbria. Fiery dragons had been seen flying through the air. A great famine had struck the land, leaving people weak and desperate.
Dragons, really?
Well, we might call them meteors or unusual aurora displays today. But to the people of 793, these were clear warnings from God that something terrible was approaching. The problem was, they assumed any divine punishment would come from familiar enemies, rival Saxon kingdoms perhaps, or the ever-present threat of Scottish raids from the north. No one, not the monks in their cells, not the king's advisors, not even the most learned scholars, imagined that heathen raiders would dare strike at the holiest site in northern England. It was simply unthinkable. The monastery's defenses were spiritual, not military. Their walls were built to keep out weather, not warriors. Their treasures lay openly displayed in the church, protected only by the fear of divine retribution. As dawn broke on June 8th, Brother Higbald was likely making his way to the scriptorium when he noticed the dark shapes on the horizon. At first, they might have seemed like merchant vessels. Traders from Francia or Frisia were not uncommon visitors. But as the ships drew closer, their true nature became unmistakable. The carved dragon heads, the shields hung along their sides, the forest of spears glinting in the morning sun. These were warships, and they were heading directly for the Holy Island.
How many ships are we talking about?
The sources are frustratingly vague, probably 3 to 5 vessels, carrying perhaps 150 to 200 warriors in total. Not a massive force by later Viking standards, but more than enough to overwhelm a monastery defended by prayer alone. The tide was high, allowing the shallow draft vessels to approach the island's shore directly. There would be no warning period, no time to flee to the mainland. The causeway that connected Lindisfarne to the Northumbrian coast was underwater. As the ships beached themselves on the sandy shore, the morning prayers of terce should have been beginning. Instead, the air filled with the sound of weapons being readied, war cries in a strange tongue, and the scraping of ships' keels against sand and stone. What happened next would be seared into the collective memory of Christendom for centuries to come. The first Vikings to reach the monastery gates likely encountered monks going about their morning duties, copying manuscripts, tending the gardens, preparing the day's meals. The reaction must have been one of complete bewilderment. These were men who had devoted their lives to prayer and learning, who had never lifted weapons in anger, who believed their sanctity provided divine protection.
Wait, so they had no idea what was happening?
I'm afraid not. The very concept of armed raiders attacking a holy site was so foreign to their worldview that many probably couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. Some may have initially thought these were warriors coming to seek sanctuary or make offerings. But comprehension came quickly enough. The raiders moved through the monastery with practiced efficiency, seeking treasure and taking captives. They knew exactly what they were looking for: gold, silver, anything portable and valuable. The great gospel books, painstakingly illuminated over months or years, were torn apart for their golden covers and jeweled bindings. Pages that represented the pinnacle of Dark Age artistry were scattered like worthless parchment. What truly horrified contemporary chroniclers wasn't just the theft, it was the violence against holy men. In the warrior cultures of Anglo-Saxon England, monasteries were traditionally respected as neutral ground. Even during the fiercest civil wars, monks were generally left unmolested. But these raiders came from a different world entirely. To them, the Christian God was a foreign deity with no claim on their loyalty or fear. The monks weren't protected holy men, they were simply obstacles to wealth or potential slaves to be sold in distant markets.
Oh God, they killed them?
Many, yes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that some were slaughtered outright, others drowned in the sea, and still others were carried off in chains to face slavery in Scandinavia. The exact numbers are lost to history, but for a small monastic community, the losses would have been devastating. Brother Higbald, who may have been among the first to spot the approaching ships, probably did not live to see the sun set that day. The aged scholars who had spent decades copying sacred texts, the young novices just beginning their religious education, all were swept up in a violence that seemed to come from another world entirely. The raiders worked with brutal efficiency. This wasn't mindless destruction. It was calculated plunder. They took what could be easily carried and sold, destroyed what couldn't be moved but might aid future defenders, and eliminated witnesses who might identify them. Perhaps most shocking to the medieval mind was the desecration of the holy spaces themselves. The church that had echoed with centuries of prayer was stripped bare. The altar where kings had once knelt was broken apart for its precious metals. The reliquaries containing the bones of saints, objects considered so sacred that touching them could cure disease or guarantee salvation, were smashed open and their contents scattered. What had been priceless spiritual treasures became mere obstacles to the silver and gold containers.
Hang on. They weren't afraid? Of, like, divine punishment?
That's precisely what made this so terrifying to Christians across Europe. These raiders showed no fear of the Christian God whatsoever. They had their own gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, and those gods rewarded boldness in battle, not piety in prayer. To a Viking warrior, dying in battle while seeking glory and treasure was the surest path to Valhalla. Divine retribution from the Christian God wasn't a deterrent. It was irrelevant to their entire worldview. This wasn't just robbery. It was a clash between two completely incompatible ways of understanding the world. And on that June day in 793, the warrior's worldview proved devastatingly more effective than the monk's faith. By afternoon, the raiders had taken everything of value that could be carried. Their ships rode low in the water, heavy with gold, silver, and precious objects that had taken generations to accumulate. The surviving monks could only watch in horror as their life's work was carried away by men they couldn't understand, speaking a language that sounded like the growling of beasts to their ears. But the raiders' work wasn't finished. Before departing, they set fire to several of the wooden buildings. Whether this was strategic, to prevent pursuit or hide evidence, or simply vindictive destruction, we'll never know. As the tide began to turn and the causeway to the mainland started to emerge from the waters, the longships pushed off from the beach. Their dragonheads, which had arrived with the dawn, now departed with the dusk, carrying their terrible cargo back across the North Sea. The survivors faced a scene of utter devastation. Buildings burned or damaged, treasures accumulated over centuries simply gone, and worst of all, brothers and friends dead or vanished into slavery. But perhaps more profound than the physical damage was the psychological impact. The basic assumptions that had governed life in Christian Europe for centuries had been shattered in a single day.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine if someone told you that gravity might just stop working tomorrow. That's how shocking this was to the medieval mind. Holy places were supposed to be protected by God. The worst that might happen would be a local war where Christian fought Christian, but even then, monasteries remained safe havens. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. If the most sacred site in Northumbria could be attacked with impunity, what monastery, what church, what Christian community was secure? News of the Lindisfarne raid spread across Europe with the speed of wildfire. The scholar Alcuin, who was at Charlemagne's court in Francia, heard the news and immediately wrote letters that have survived to this day. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race," he wrote. "The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." These weren't just the words of a shocked observer. They were a recognition that the world had fundamentally changed. A new threat had emerged from the northern seas, one that played by completely different rules.
So this really was the beginning?
Absolutely. June 8th, 793, marks the traditional start of the Viking Age. Not because it was the first Norse raid ever, there had been smaller attacks before, but because it was the first that truly announced to the world that a new power had arrived. Within a year, the raiders had struck again. In 794, they hit the monastery at Jarrow, the very place where the Venerable Bede had written his great histories just decades before. But this time, the defenders were somewhat prepared, and the raiders suffered casualties. This taught both sides important lessons. The Vikings learned that future raids would need to be larger and better organized. The Anglo-Saxons learned that prayer alone would not protect them. They would need walls, weapons, and warriors. By 795, the raiders had reached Ireland, attacking the monastery on Rathlin Island. The pattern was becoming clear. Hit isolated, wealthy targets, preferably on islands or coasts where longships could approach undetected and escape quickly. Monasteries that had stood undefended for centuries began hiring guards, building walls, and even relocating their treasures inland. The age of the defenseless monastery was over. The Lindisfarne raid didn't just announce the beginning of the Viking Age, it fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval Europe. Coastal communities that had thrived on trade now lived in constant fear. Kings who had spent their resources on fighting each other suddenly faced a new external threat that required different tactics and strategies. The old Anglo-Saxon feared system, designed for territorial wars between kingdoms, was poorly suited to defending against lightning-fast coastal raids. The economic impact was equally severe. Trade routes that had operated safely for generations now carried new risks. Insurance, if it had existed, would have become prohibitively expensive.
So it wasn't just about one monastery?
Oh, far from it. Lindisfarne was just the beginning, the proof of concept, you might say. It demonstrated that even the most protected targets in Christian Europe were vulnerable to well-organized raiders who didn't share Christian beliefs about sacred space. The psychological impact of the Lindisfarne raid extended far beyond its immediate aftermath. For the first time in centuries, the expansion of Christianity had been violently reversed. Sacred spaces had been desecrated, holy men had been killed or enslaved, and the perpetrators had escaped unpunished. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a crisis of faith. How could God allow his most devoted servants to be slaughtered in his own house? Why had divine protection failed so completely? Some saw it as divine punishment for the sins of the Christian kingdoms, the civil wars, the corruption, the failures of piety. Others interpreted it as a test of faith, a trial that would ultimately strengthen the church. But for the survivors of Lindisfarne itself, such theological debates must have seemed hollow. They had lost their friends, their life's work, and their sense of safety in the world.
So something good came out of it?
That's complicated. Certainly, the Vikings contributed to European culture, trade, and exploration in ways that went far beyond raiding. They established cities, trade networks, and even kingdoms. But it's hard to call the death and enslavement at Lindisfarne good, even if it was part of larger historical processes.
So we're still feeling the effects today? It's incredible that one day could change so much.